everyone. Thank you for being here. I hope this conference has been a blessing to you thus far. I'm sure all of you noticed, but there are surveys in your seat. So we'll give you 5 minutes at the end of the session to fill that out. So if you could just keep that in mind. If you want to write the name of the talk at the title right now, that would be probably really helpful. Or if you want to write Dr. Calais at the top as well, just so we know which talk you're surveying, that would be great. But without further ado, this is How to Lead with Compassion and Build Resilient Teams Through Trauma-Informed Leadership. And I'm proud to introduce Dr. Calais.
All right, great. Hi, everybody. Thanks. Awesome. All right, so I'm lucky to have the talk right after lunch. Hopefully you guys are still awake. I'm Chante Calais. I'm a family physician, and most of these years I've spent time working with underserved communities in various aspects. I've worked in jails. I've done foster care work. I've worked mostly in inner city, but I'm currently practicing in a rural FQHC at the moment. And I'm also currently a coach. So I'm an executive and leadership coach, where I help leaders who are really focused on being purpose-driven to help develop their goals and figure out how to move forward in their businesses. But today I'm going to be talking to you about how to lead with compassion and build resilient teams through trauma-informed leadership. So previously, last year when I gave a talk, I was praying on the airplane. I was like, Lord, I need a really great introduction. And as soon as I said that, one say, if there's any medical staff on the plane, can you please come to the front of the aircraft? So I didn't pray that prayer this time. I made sure not to do that. Okay. All right. But to get started, I just want to kind of get a sense of who's in the room. So if there are any clinicians, maybe physicians, PAs, NPs. Okay, great. Anybody in mental health, behavioral health? Okay, great. Awesome. Any administrators here? Great. Any executives on the executive team? Awesome. Anybody in residency leadership at all? Okay. Medical schools? Okay, great. And then any students or residents? Awesome. Did I miss anyone? Receptionist, admin. Yes, we need our admin. Awesome. Great. So it's nice to know that you guys all came here. I hope I don't let you down. I did post in WOVA on the app some of these questions. So if you want to take a moment, you'll be able to see a poll that asks, what do you hope to gain from this presentation? Okay, for time's sake, I'll just review some of the results. So in first place is improve personal burnout and personal development strategies. And that is a hot topic. Every year that I've attended this conference, I've found that everybody is wanting to learn how to prevent burnout, or maybe they're burnout already, hoping to get some extra prayers and some guidance, which is probably why some of the sessions, I attended a session on rest on yesterday, and it's like 50 people signed up. So I understand. And the next, second would be learn to build resilient teams and increase retention. So I know for a lot of organizations, retention is an issue. So this concept of learning how to help our team members and us as leaders be more resilient is going to be important to discuss. And then in third place is learn how to implement trauma-informed leadership practices in your organization, which I hope by the end of this talk, you'll have a better understanding of how to do that. And lastly, it seems like not many people are already using trauma-informed approaches, so I think this will be great. All right, so these are some expectations. I mentioned last year, oftentimes I grew up in the Black church where people talk back to you. So I know at these sessions, everybody's seated quietly and hoping to gain so much information from the speaker, but actually I'm going to challenge you guys to talk back to me so that we could, all right. Somebody else went to the same church, I guess. There you go. Awesome. So I would like you guys' feedback. If you have questions as we're going through, feel free to ask them, to talk. I feel like one way of learning is really us engaging in conversation. I like to call myself an expert conversationalist. I have the honor, especially as a physician, to hear people's problems, some things I don't want to hear all the time. Sometimes they're strangers, and it's such an honor that people get to share those things with me, but I converse all the time. That's what I do for a living. So it's great. You guys are now part of the conversation. So we're going to talk. We're going to laugh. My jokes are not great, but still laugh anyway. Okay. We're going to cry, hopefully not at my jokes, but because we're talking about trauma, sometimes we can be discussing some sensitive topics. So I do want to just give that warning for you guys. And mostly we're going to transform. So our hope in this conversation is that we'll be able to gain knowledge, but kind of transform our thinking as well and bring it back to our respective places of work, to our families, to our communities. Okay, so the objectives of this talk, we're going to define trauma and its impact. It's very common. You guys may have already, by a show of hands, who've heard of trauma-informed care. Yeah. So that idea seems to be more common, and more people are aware of the impacts of trauma and how they affect our communities, how they affect often our clinic settings and our workplaces. So I think that'll be important to discuss. Then we're going to recognize how trauma itself is influencing our leaders and leadership, and how it influences our teams as well. And then we want to talk about, knowing what we know about trauma and trauma-informed care, how can we infuse that into leadership? Because sometimes there's a disconnect where we've become really good at being able to focus on our patients with trauma-informed care, but we're not always doing that in the organization. So just making sure that it's trickling, into those spaces as well. And then I'm just going to give you some kind of practical applications that would be helpful for organizations on how to infuse trauma-informed care in the culture. So we're going to talk about what is trauma and what is trauma-informed care. So what is trauma? Told you it was going to be interactive. Anybody? What do you think of when you think of trauma? Okay, great. You mentioned that trauma is when something bad happens. Another definition that we heard in the audience is that trauma is when one event or multiple events have happened that start to shape your worldview, how you see God, how you experience life. Is that right? Okay. Anybody else? Any other thoughts? Okay, great. I like the dictionary. Now we have lots of AI and all kinds of things, I guess, we're competing with. But Oxford Dictionary defines trauma as a deeply distressing or a disturbing experience, essentially something bad that has happened. And then when we're thinking about things like PTSD, if you look at DSM-5, it's exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. What I want to emphasize here is actual or threatened. Sometimes trauma can happen not from something that actually happened to you, but almost happened to you can be traumatic as well. And then when you think about it, it could be something that directly happened to you, something you witnessed. So even if you didn't experience the direct trauma, if you saw someone else going through a traumatic situation, that also can leave someone feeling with feelings of trauma. And then often if it happens to someone who is close to you, like a family member, then that's also traumatic. Those are some of the definitions of trauma. Everybody understands what trauma is. Great. Now let's talk about trauma-informed care. What do you know about trauma-informed care? Everybody raise their hand so I should get lots of responses. Okay, so is it just you've heard of trauma-informed care and you don't really know what it is? She said that trauma-informed care is recognizing that someone may have experienced trauma. When you practice, you do it in a way that you don't want to re-traumatize the person. SAMHSA does a good job with they came up with what's called the 4 R's, and I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with this, but basically it's how you can view trauma-informed care. The first thing is to realize. Realizing means you recognize that trauma and its impact is everywhere, right? We see it, especially if specifically CCHF focuses on marginalized communities. We're seeing the effects and trauma in various ways, so we realize that, right? And then also recognizing what are some of the signs of trauma. I know on one of the other polls that a few of you already filled out, we talked about if there's screening done at your organization or your clinics, and oftentimes we are doing screening questions, we're asking about abuse, things like that. This is how we do the recognition part of it, responding. So it's one thing to realize that there's trauma and even recognize the impact that it has, but what are we doing to respond? And that's making sure that we ourselves as leaders and organization, that we have policies and procedures and things put in place to actually help in that response. And then you mentioned not re-traumatizing. Because we know all of this information about trauma, What are we doing to assure that when someone comes into our prospective clinics, that we're not re-traumatizing them? I took this diagram from one of the papers that I was researching, and they talked a lot about the ingredients of having trauma-informed care. And what I've found is that most of us do a really good job on the clinical side of it. A lot of us, when it comes to trying to get the patients more involved or doing screening, oftentimes we may even have specific training about how to influence our patients, how to work with them, especially if they've had traumatic events, suffered PTSD, those types of things. And then what people are really, really good at, which I've noticed, is to refer. If a patient comes in, and this is what I've seen this often, where the patient come in, you think they're coming to get their blood pressure medication refilled, and then they tell you about this traumatic event that happened to them. A lot of us may want to pause, right, and push back, but many of us realize we should lean in, because just prescribing their medication will not necessarily make a big impact on their situation. But if you lean in, you'll realize that even if you prescribe the medication, they can't afford it, or they don't have transportation to the pharmacy, or there are other factors that may limit them from actually taking it. I know there are lots of great organizations that we can partner with to help patients to navigate trauma, which should be used. But we also have to remember that we also can play a small role. I'm hoping that through this talk, we can realize what are the things we can actually do. Now, when it comes to the organizational side, I feel like we're quite a bit away from that. Most organizations are still trying to figure out the clinical aspect. But I'm hoping that as we talk through this, we'll be able to give you some pointers of how you can bring this back to your organizations. And then, so what is the impact of trauma on leadership and teams? I would like to hear from you guys. What is the impact of trauma? What have you seen? She was just mentioning. Can you guys all hear what she said? Okay, great. Which is very true, right? If most of your staff is living in a part of the same community that has been traumatized, and that is an added layer of challenge sometimes, because they may not always have the skills on how to navigate when someone else that's presenting to them has those same traumas without getting re-traumatized. Great. Any other thoughts on how trauma can affect the leadership in teams? You guys are all leaders in some capacity here. How has trauma impacted you? And it doesn't have to be your own personal trauma, which can be part of it, but how is just the trauma of others that you've worked with, maybe the patients? How do you feel like that impacts team dynamics? If you have poor coping mechanisms, and some of those coping mechanisms, I was going to get to this part later, but there's really like 3 responses to trauma, especially as leaders, that I've seen. And even I'll talk more about specific papers that I was reading where they were surveying lots of people who are either clinicians or in leadership roles. And they talked about this. The 3 responses. One was you have a superhero comp. If you are, and most of us, we're clearly called to do this work. So there's an element of wanting to save everyone, wanting to be the hero, wanting to save the day. And clearly that can lead to burnout, right? I've been there. Okay. I definitely understand. The other response is really the step away response. It's overwhelming. I don't want to have to deal with this. This is too much for me. I don't know what to do. Oftentimes, that also is not a healthy way of managing the situation. And then thirdly is the critic, the one who's like always complaining, this is horrible. I don't know how to deal with this. This is too much for me. And all of those responses, maybe you have experienced them at some point, are not always the best. So those are some, I would say, poor coping mechanisms for trauma and leadership. Awesome. So I started off my talk saying I did not pray this time to the Lord about my intro while I was on the plane because of what happened to me last year. And so I did not do that, right? So I was very intentional not to do that. But God gave me a great intro and it happened on the plane. There you go. I don't know. Every year it happens like this. So as I was on the plane, there was my flight attendant who, he overall, I guess, was kind, but was very persistent that my bag was not far enough underneath the seat. Okay. So the first time she came by, she was like, well, you need to put your bag, as we're actively putting our bag under the seat, you need to make sure your bag is under the seat. Okay. I put the bag under the seat. She came back around again. And then she said, your bag is not far enough under the seat. I need to be able to see your shoes. I can't see any straps hanging from the backpack. I need you to push it under the seat. It's like, okay. It's like, you know what? I can just move my bag and go and put it in one of the overhead bins to make sure there's no issue. As I was there, I'm thinking like, wow, she's pretty intense about this bag under the seat. What's going on? And even after our plane landed and I was waiting for my carry-on bag on the jet bridge, a guy sitting across from me was like, wow, wasn't she so intense about the bag under the seat? Clearly, other people noticed these behaviors. But while I was on the plane, what made it even more interesting is that same flight attendant, she had to sit next to me during the flight. And then the Holy Spirit kept saying that I needed to talk to her. I needed to pray with her. And so I started talking to her. And, I'm an expert conversationalist, right? I do this all the time. Asked, hey, what did you do? How long have you been a flight attendant? And she's like, about 8 years. And I'm like, what were you doing before? She was like, I was a microbiologist. I'm like, oh, very interesting. And she tells me how she was working for this infectious disease clinic for several years. And, we're making small talk. I'm listening to her. And then after, we kind of had our little, I told her I was coming here to talk and what I did. And then I asked, is there something I can pray for you about? And she said, she paused. You can feel her getting kind of choked up. And have you guys had those moments where, And she said, well, my sister just passed away. And I just need you to pray for my mother because it's really hard on her. And in that moment, I prayed with her. She cried. And in my prayer, I was very intentional. And I said, Lord, help her to see that this is part of her ministry, being a flight attendant. What she does, how she behaves, how she interacts with other people will go on to make such a big impact because she doesn't know who's coming in and out of the plane. After we were done with the talk, she was so thankful. She said, hope your talk goes well. Everyone have a great day. She was a different person. But that was my introduction to trauma-informed leadership. And that's what it looks like. It looks like honoring the person. It looks like recognizing the humanity in a person and realizing that oftentimes their behaviors are a reflection of what they're going through, what they've been through, the trauma that they've experienced. So I had a real life view and experience of what trauma-informed leadership looked like on the plane, and I didn't pray about it this time. We've talked about a little bit about what trauma looks like in leadership, and I thought this graphic was just very funny. This is sometimes how we can feel in a traumatized system, right? We can feel like there's no time really for collaboration with each other. Yeah, it's very extreme. But honestly, hopefully no one's behaving like this at work. I don't know if there's any HR in here. I don't know what happens if you behave this way. But sometimes we can internally feel this way, right? When it comes to the system that we're a part of. So on one hand, we're trying to make an impact. We're trying to be present and available for our patients, for our communities. But at the same time, it can be overwhelming. And it's a big role that we're playing. So what does a traumatized system look like? So there's not a lot of time for collaboration. Oftentimes, people are burnt out. There's a lot of turnover. There's often traumatic events like violence. So I have been doing this work for a long time. I've seen medical assistants get into fights in the clinic spaces. There's been shooting outside. Someone has tried to steal my catalytic converter. As I was walking out of the clinic, they were underneath my car. I mean, I have seen a whole gamut of things as it relates to violence and trauma. And there's suicide. Physicians have a high rate of suicide. I still remember in residency, There was a code blue that was called near the elevators, near the administrative offices. And it was because at the time, the pediatric program director committed suicide in his office. I have been a part of those experiences. And, because I'm family medicine and they were pediatrics, all the peds residents were pulled off. We had to go ahead and take their positions throughout the hospital and navigate that. So trauma is really close. And even if we haven't had our own personal traumas, we've had secondary trauma through the things that we've seen, the things we've witnessed, our patient experiences. And then there's, the patient needs versus the health system. And sometimes it could feel as if it's two separate things, right? You want to be moving the organization forward. We have to think about budgeting. We have to think about meeting all of these measures. But then you're also needing to care for the community, for the patients themselves, what they need. And they don't always seem to align. The demands of documentation. I'm still praying about that one. These are some things I've heard. I've done some work with lots of executives, and these are some things that I hear. I haven't had a vacation in a long time. I don't remember the last time I took a vacation. And oftentimes they feel like if they leave, there's going to be so much more work when they come back. So it's hard for them to take breaks. There's one guy. He did not like the way that he was being treated by some of the leadership, and he ended up resigning. And he saw one of the leaders at the grocery store and ended up yelling at him. So clearly there's some extreme, burnout. And then some people are just like, that's not my problem. Figure out what their role is. They feel like their role is very specific. And if someone comes to them with issues or problems, they're like, hands off. This is not my problem to deal with. As I mentioned with the story about the flight attendant, sometimes people's reactions and even these, leaders, their reactions is not based on necessarily that they're not interested or that they don't care. It's just from their experiences and the things that they've gone through. I'm going to talk about trauma-informed leadership. This is a definition I found that was very helpful as we're all still learning, what trauma-informed leadership is. And it says trauma-informed leadership goes beyond traditional management approaches by acknowledging the impact of trauma on individuals and organizations and adopting strategies to create safe and empowering workplaces. This is ultimately the goal. It's hard to get here, but this is what we're aiming for. That's great when people can feel like they're not alone and a part of the organization. And sometimes I think that's a great point that you made, that someone else came to support the person who had experienced that. There's not always a lot of debriefing. If you're in a very busy clinic setting, as a clinician, you may not be able to debrief. You may have had a very violent patient, but there's not always a built-in system where people can debrief. They're debriefing at home. They're calling their family members on their ride home to discuss like, oh my gosh, you won't believe what happened to me at work today, right? But there's not always a culture where people are feeling supported. So I think that's really great. All right, awesome. Let me see what you guys said here. So in first place is using referrals and partner organizations, which is great. I think there is definitely a place for referrals. And a lot of it sometimes is because we don't feel equipped enough to deal with it. But there is a place to have organizations who are very skilled and understand what the needs are of our patients. It's good that you guys are using that. And second was training staff, which you guys mentioned in trauma-informed care. And then third was getting patients involved in the treatment process. It just looks like still not a lot of people are using specific trauma-informed practices. What I want to do at this part of the talk is just go through some cases where you guys can kind of group up and discuss amongst yourself how you would manage a case. I really always get some very interesting. I have good stories because crazy things happen all the time. But these are all based on true stories. The initial case is about the hard worker. There's a medical assistant. She was always on time. She was always going the extra mile to really be present and helpful. And then she verbalized that she preferred to just stay at our one clinic versus having to be afloat where she was having to travel to all the other clinics. What I want you guys to do when you're discussing the cases is how are you going to use trauma-informed care as you're navigating these particular situations? And what, if any, have you been using in your own experiences in your clinics, in your organizations. Could be there. And then there's doing more. With this particular person, everyone was complaining that she's lazy or could be doing more. And you notice, she's on her phone most of the time instead of rooming the patients. She's often the first one asking or telling people what time she's going to go to lunch. Does that sound familiar to anyone? And then you're getting a lot of complaints from the providers about that particular person. So how would you navigate that? And then lastly, the hard to get along with. It's a newer provider and she yells at staff. She yells at patients. Multiple team members have actually resigned because they felt like it was too difficult to navigate working with her. There was a patient who was suicidal. And she assumed that behavioral health would come in and talk with the patient. She left at the end of her shift and the patient was still in the room. Okay, so these are all based on true stories. What we'll do is, for the sake of time, I'll kind of divide each group. So we'll kind of do 3 groups. So what we can do is the first 3 roles over here, you guys can have the hard worker. And then these next, let's see, those 2 roles right there, you can have could be doing more. And then the last 2 rows, hard to get along with, if you guys want to kind of talk amongst yourself. And then we'll divide this group over the same over here. So the first probably 3 groups, the 3 rows right here, you can have the first one, hard worker. The next 2, it's could be doing more, and the last 2, hard to get along with. We'll have you guys kind of discuss, think about how would you navigate these situations? How can you use what you know about trauma-informed care? And even if you think of what policies or procedures or things could be helpful, and then we'll discuss afterwards. Good. I heard a lot of good conversation. I would love to hear your thoughts, and then I'll let you guys know kind of how we navigated these situations. For the hard worker, these first 3 rows on either side, does anybody want to share what you guys discussed? Awesome. I think that's great. So starting with questions. Oftentimes we can start with assumptions. And even people who are in maybe managerial roles, it's like, well, you're going to mess up the schedule. I had you as a float. You're thinking about those things versus asking and trying to understand why she's not wanting to. Because clearly she's a hard worker. She's been there. So maybe there's something more that's going on. Okay. How about you guys? All right, so healthy compromise, okay. And oftentimes what we can see is people who are good at what they do, who follow the rules, who don't complain. Sometimes people can take advantage of that, especially, in her role as a medical assistant. She may not want to talk to her like nursing supervisor and let her know what's going on for fear of losing her job or maybe previous experiences. So you're right, that's a good point. So with her, what I asked her was, this was in just a casual conversations before the float idea came up, was, I like to talk to people. People like to talk about their children oftentimes. That's, so I was saying, oh, wow, while you work so hard, while you're working, are your kids with, a parent or someone helping you? And she was like, no. She said that she didn't grow up with having parents. She was actually a foster child, and she's had to do all of the things on her own. And then later, over time of working with her, she was being abused by her partner. So she had a lot of trauma. But if you did not ask any questions and you just looked at her work ethic, very hardworking, you would never expect that she was going through so many traumatic things. Her car had gotten broken into. It wasn't really drivable. So that kind of goes with probably why she doesn't want to float around. It's hard to get to work. She doesn't have help with her children. So just trying to ask questions, it opens up a whole world. And what can happen is if you're really good at what you do, especially for some of like medical assistants or support staff, if they don't feel heard, they go somewhere else because they're really good, they'll get hired, and we can miss out on actually a really great employee who can benefit our organizations because we didn't really understand what they needed. Let's go with could be doing more. Anyone on those next 2 rows, what did you guys get from there? Exactly. All right. It's interesting how we can have so many expectations of people, but they don't know those expectations, right? So often the training, there's a lapse in training, and it depends on who's doing the training. So in a lot of the clinic scenarios, there may have been another medical assistant who was training them, but they didn't learn properly themselves. They were not aware of the things they should be doing. What ended up happening with her is I actually didn't have a problem with her work ethic. which was interesting because everyone else did, but my approach was very different. What I do typically, and this is part of recognizing trauma-informed care, is that I highlight the good things that she is doing and what she wants to do. So she told me she wanted to be a PA, right? She wants to go to PA school. She's very interested. When I was seeing patients, if there is some interesting finding, I would let her come into the room and see that. I helped her to feel very involved. While someone's experience was like, she's lazy, she's not rooming my patients. For me, she would text me and say, we're working in this area today. I already printed out this information. We have so many patients. That was a very different person than what everybody else is seeing, is because when you honor people and recognize who they are, then they can show up as their best selves. When you tell people like, hey, you're not doing a good job at this, or you need to do this better, and you're honing in on the negative parts versus helping them see the positive parts of who they are, then that really can be reflective of her pulling back. Some of her pulling back was because she didn't enjoy working with those providers. Yes, she's on her phone, but it's not always intentionally because she doesn't want to do the work. It's because she's feeling frustrated in her job. But when you empower people and recognize the value that they bring, then they will bring that. They will work to that level. So I had a different experience with her altogether, which why she preferred working with me, but I didn't mind working with her because I never felt she was lazy. She was organized. She was just a very different person with me than with other providers. But it's teaching us as leaders that we have power and can bring compassion and humility, and that is what helps to change and transform people. This experience happened several years ago, and by the time that I had at the time, I was a newer physician, was just starting, and everyone knew that this was an issue when I got there. And I made the mistake of, I think, putting on my CV something about I enjoy mentorship and helping people to grow. They strategically put me with her to work with her. And they're like, we know you want to help people to grow and be a mentor. We have someone who's great that you can mentor and be a part of. Sometimes you get pulled into those roles. My first thought was like, okay, has HR been involved? Like, what are we doing? And what I learned over time, nothing had really been done. Everybody knew she was a problem. Sometimes you can feel like there's a need for providers because in the work that we do, it's hard to get providers. Sometimes I wonder if that could have been a barrier, but nothing was being done. And then I was not even in a leadership role. I basically created an improvement plan for her. And I say just a physician, but we're all leaders, right? I was just a physician in a physician role at the time. I wasn't in leadership at the time. But I realized that if no one else was going to make a change, then I needed to do something. So I kindly drafted an email. I cited references. It was a very thorough email. I looked up on Workplace, what are some ways that we can help empower people who are struggling or may not seem to be a good fit for the team. I just went ahead and did that. What ended up happening, and often what happens is once you start working with individuals who are having challenges, they will naturally realize that they're not a good fit. And she ended up resigning over time, she didn't renew her contract, essentially. Sometimes, even if you're not in administration, is how you approach it. So I didn't approach it saying like, she's this horrible person and you guys need to do more. It was like, what can we do to support her? Maybe she's not feeling supported. Have you guys had conversations with her? What are things that we can implement? Maybe she's seeing too many patients. What are the check-ins? Are you guys checking in about the complaints? Things like that. Sometimes that's what's needed. And for the sake of time, I'll go through quickly the rest of these slides. What ends up happening is there's usually a disconnect between like clinician, staff, and leadership. And in one of the research studies, what happened was it was called Trauma-Informed Leadership and Post-Traumatic Growth. And what they did after surveying people post-COVID about their experiences was, this is what clinicians and staff are saying. They want to be heard. They want to feel protected in their workspaces. They want to feel like someone's prepared them for the role that they're actually playing. And they want to feel cared for and honored. And then what happens is leadership also feels a similar way. They want someone to support them and hear the grievances of the people that they're managing. They want to know how to, better understand their people that they're leading, and to be able to lead with honor. So what happens is we're all saying the same things, but there's a disconnect between those things. When we think about the leaders, what happens is we've had our own personal traumas, our secondary traumas, as we mentioned. There's compassion fatigue. All of you here, I assume, are very compassionate, right? This is also why you chose to attend this conference, because you want to serve the marginalized. And a lot of us are burnt out, frankly, because of the way that the system is. But I love the scripture, and it says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking in anything." So the challenges that we have, the struggles that we experience, the trauma that we felt is what makes us very passionate about giving back and serving. I have my own trauma history. I grew up in poverty. While I was a second year in medical school, my cousin was shot and killed, and she was shot in the head because of gun violence. Wrong place, wrong time. Like, I've experienced and seen on a personal level some of the traumatic issues and things that can happen in life. But then we also have the secondary traumas where I'm working in places, and a lot of you are as well, where there are challenges, where we're seeing our communities suffering in different ways. There's joy. Despite how, this is a heavy topic talking about trauma, there is joy. And I love this idea of resilience. Oftentimes, we want to be resilient. We want to allow the things that have happened to us and be able to move forward. But I love this definition, and it also comes from that same paper, Trauma-Informed Care and Post-Traumatic Growth. Often we see resilience as just making it through. We weather the storm, right? We can face difficult situations in a successful way. But I love this idea of post-traumatic growth. It's not just stopping as resilient, like, yes, I made it through that hard and challenging season, but I'm also growing. Thinking about, from this standpoint, like, what are the positive changes that I now have because of a result of these traumatic experiences? That's looking at having more now opportunities. How are your relationships changing with other people, your personal strength, having greater appreciation for life, and change in your belief system? I'm just quickly going to go through what it looks like to be a trauma-informed leader. This came out of a webinar called Implementing Trauma-Informed Care into Organizational Culture and Practice. This is what it looks like to be a trauma-informed leader. Instead of asking, what's wrong with you? Like in the case of maybe what we said, the lazy medical assistant, we can ask, what happened to you? It sounds different even in asking that question, right? We can lead with humility and compassion, have empathy. Jesus was amazing at doing those things. Jesus led people who experienced trauma all of the time. We have to make sure we're servant leaders and that we're open to learning from others. What can happen in leadership is oftentimes people, when you are leading, you can have a sense of autonomy, you can be a decision maker, but we have to remember that we are serving others. We have to be open to learning from other people. And the next is recognizing your own personal trauma and healing from it. Just because you're a leader doesn't mean you did not experience trauma, or you don't have to deal with your own traumatic situations. You have to be in a healed place to be able to interact with other people. Imagine if I was just so tired and fatigued on the airplane and I couldn't have time to talk to the flight attendant because I just thought she was rude and just making my day more miserable, right? If we're coming from a healed place, then that's how we make impact. That's how we can actually make change. Self-care, soul care, all of those things are important. And lastly, having a clear sense of purpose. Within yourself, you have to know why you're here, what you feel like the Lord is calling you to do. But in your organization, there has to be a clear purpose and mission. That's what is going to be used to hire people. That's what's going to be used to teach people how to move forward. If you're unclear about what you're supposed to be doing, how can you lead someone else to do that, right? So those are going to be important factors. Lastly, what I want to talk about is from an organizational standpoint. This is what really helps when you're thinking about trauma-informed principles. So the first thing is teach. People don't know if you don't teach them. So we have to teach. Even our leaders, executives themselves need to learn as well how to be more trauma informed, right? How to lead with compassion, how to see people with humility. But then you have to model it. Just doing an online teaching session is not enough. We have to show people with us as individuals modeling those things, and then having other people who can model it as well. We have to empower people. And then lastly, do evaluations. Jesus clearly is a great example of a leader who was aware of trauma-informed principles. I also think about Joseph. Imagine his story with his brothers, right? And he did evaluating, right? So when they came to him and they were wanting food, he tested them by leaving that silver cup in Benjamin's backpack. And as a result, he had to see, had they changed? Were they actually living it out, or were they just saying those things? We have to do a similar thing. And then I think about Paul, who was really great when it comes to leading while suffering. Sometimes these are great biblical examples. And then this is the last point. What are practices that you can put in your organization? From an organizational level is that you start with the organization itself. There has to be buy-in from the people who are leading that understand that trauma-informed care is important. And you need time to implement this. There's been some talks about culture. Culture takes a long time to develop. So thinking that, you did one online module and maybe someone kind of modeled trauma-informed care, or I came in and gave a talk to your organization, that is not going to be enough to really make a huge shift, but it's a start. So culture, it just takes time to develop that. And then all members, so a lot of the studies, and I'll list them at the end of the talk, they were training everyone. I mean, security guards got the same training. Everyone in the system was getting this training. And then you need champions or coaches, individuals who are kind of on the front line, in a sense, working in the clinic systems, who can be modeling this, who can be evaluating, who can be encouraging and coaching others. And then just a few other things that were used. At the beginning of meetings, people were using grounding practices. They were using mindfulness, gratitude. You can use prayer, affirmations to add into the kind of culture of the team itself. And then just making sure that your goals for the organizations are lined up with trauma-informed care. Thinking about these items. One last thing is a calm space. One organization, they actually had a place where you could go and sit and be calm. If there is something happening in the clinic, people are feeling frustrated, there is an actual physical space where you could step away and go in there. And then, of course, recognition. We talked about the hard worker initially. People don't get recognized. We get complaints. Even as a physician, most people don't say a whole lot unless you do something wrong, right? We need to recognize, empower, and encourage each other. I just wanted to leave you guys with that.
Right. Thank you so much, everyone.